Right, well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, may I thank you all for inviting me to cross the pond to come and talk to you about what we believe to be one of the most exciting stained glass conservation projects anywhere in Europe at the moment. But as I'm directing it, I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm actually going to talk not so much about the conservation, but actually what we have learnt through the conservation process, how we have been able to use our observations to understand more about the creation of this great window, which was made by the man whose name appears in the title, John Thornton. So, just a few words. My subtitle is What Do We Know Now That We Didn't Know Then? And in case, amazingly, you haven't visited York, this is my shot to entice you to the city, showing you how York Minster dominates the skyline of a city which still feels, in many respects, very medieval. My focus is going to be on the Great East Window of York Minster, and for reasons which will become apparent, we're able to date this window with a considerable amount of confidence because we have a contract for it. We've known about it for a long time. It's the greatest expanse of medieval stained glass anywhere in Britain, and probably one of the biggest windows ever made in the late Middle Ages. But the opportunity to conserve it gave us an opportunity also to look at it afresh. And this is its architectural context. You see the exterior of the eastern facade and the interior of the choir. And although the window fills the east wall, it actually lights the entire eastern arm of the cathedral. This is actually what it looks like at the moment because it's undergoing a massive amount of conservation of stone, and of course it's never a good idea to leave medieval windows anywhere in contact with masons, so we brought all the glass out of the church and put it into store. And at the same time we were asked to review what conservation, if any, was desirable, and indeed you can imagine it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to engage with this amazing window, which for the most part depicts the apocalypse, the revelation of St. John the Divine. And one of the most fascinating things about this window is that unlike many medieval windows, we actually have a contract surviving in 3 17th century transcriptions. The medieval original doesn't survive. And this contract, here seen in an English translation, tells us a lot of things about the window. It tells us, for example, that the man responsible for creating it was John Thornton of Coventry. So in other words, he's not a native glass painter of York, he's been brought in to do this job. And one of the questions is, well, why? York in the 15th century was knee-deep in very skilled glass painters, but they felt the need to bring in a foreigner. Well, what does the contract tell us? In summary, it names the master. It tells us, as contracts often do, that you have a deadline to meet. And we know he met the deadline of 1408 because the date actually appears in the window itself. It tells us something about that the costs of the materials and the workforce to assist him would be paid by the dean and chapter. And this is infuriating because it means we don't actually know how many people were working with him, and we don't actually know what the total cost of the materials was. We also know that Thornton was to paint some of the window with his own hand. It actually says, according to the ordination of the dean and chapter where need required. So we know he was actually a glass painter. But he was actually, the one thing he was to do entirely with his own hand was to cartoon the window, to portray the window. And we're talking about over 300 panels of stained glass. So to cartoon 300 panels and supervise the window and get it up there in 3 years was no mean feat. Some key dates. He really was a real person. He pops up in 1405 when he signs the contract for the Great East Window. He is the recipient of a bequest in 1406. He became a freeman of the city in 1410. This is when the Great East Window is finished, and this is the point at which he wants to be free to go and do work outside the liberty of the cathedral. To do that, to operate more widely in the city, he has to be a freeman. He secured a lease, however, on a property in Coventry, a 60-year lease, which suggests that he was actually running workshops in two cities. And probably about 1415, he also made the St. William window in the Minster. And his last reference in the documentary record is in 1433, when he lives in Stonegate. Now, if you know York, you'll know that Stonegate is a principal thoroughfare running up to the cathedral. It's where all the other glass painters were living in the 15th century. And he's still there, leasing a property from the Dean and Chapter. So, the first thing that we know about his operation is that he was required to paint some of the window, to likewise paint the same where need required, according to the ordination of the Dean and Chapter. So my question to myself is, well, can we therefore identify in this window which parts were actually painted by John Thornton? We don't really understand what where need required might mean in contemporary terms. One of our suppositions was that perhaps he and he alone painted all the heads of God the Father. In other words, you know, the most important figure in the window was this one, entrusted exclusively to John Thornton. The problem is, when you scan through the window, you discover that the heads of God the Father are clearly painted by different artists. There are a number of painters entrusted with this head. So, what about the heads of St. John, who is both the witness and the narrator of the book of Revelation? Well, similarly, there are actually a variety of hands painting the head of John. So again, this search for the hand of John Thornton sort of slightly kind of breaks down. And of course, there is the matter too of a generic style. Within the window, there is clearly a kind of general generic similarity across the whole window, and it may be that what we see here is Thornton's influence working through a workshop. Whoops, went too far. And then, of course, the question is, to what extent was Thornton engaged in painting or determining the appearance of all of the decorative elements? Because one of the things we cannot do is say that this is less well painted or less expert. There is no quality division between the finest heads and all the details. It's universally painted to an extraordinarily high standard, both at the very top of the apex of the tracery and throughout the window as a whole. So actually, we have to conclude that, at least for the time being, we cannot identify John Thornton as a glass painter. We're also, however, told that the one thing he was to do exclusively with his own hand was to produce the cartoons. Portraying means the cartooning process. And I just want to mention in this regard that I've learnt a great deal from talking to my student Anna Santolaria, who is going to bring out a publication on the medieval glazing table from Girona in Spain later this year. And it's certainly very much the case that one learns from one's own students. Well, what does the portraying mean in the medieval context? Does Thornton, therefore, have the job of producing the master plan for the whole window, which in summary is about the beginning and the end of everything? At the very apex of the window, we have God the Father with the book open on his knee and the words, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, I am the beginning and the end." And then on the schematic, you can see we have God the Father and the company of heaven. We have 27 Old Testament scenes, and then we have the apocalypse cycle, which, if you like, is the main event as far as this window is concerned. One of the extraordinary things about the window too is that there is within the tracery some evidence of a kind of subtle numerological significance at play. And this is not work I have done, this is work done by my colleague Christopher Norton. And if you know Christopher, you will know that he is not a kind of Da Vinci Code kind of art historian. So when he comes up with numerological significances, I'm inclined to take them seriously. It's long been noticed that there are tripartite divisions of the tracery, both vertically and horizontally, and it's a bit of a no-brainer that 3 is a very significant number in Christian numerology in the Middle Ages. It was also long noticed that the tracery lights are 144 in number, which is very close to the 144 of the elect in heaven, according to the book of Revelation. The Old Testament scenes number 27, so a bit of simple arithmetic secures that number. If you then go on doing a cumulative arithmetic, you arrive at the number of 81, which is the number of apocalypse panels. And in some medieval texts, 81 was regarded as the span of human life. And then if you mix all that up together, you get 19,683. Now, in certain medieval writings, including writing that informed the creation of the pavement of Westminster Abbey, this number was believed to be the span of human years between the creation and the end of the world. So they may simply be extraordinary coincidences, but they do require some kind of explanation. And we suspect that this kind of level of symbolic thought comes not from the glass painter's workshop, but probably from the clerical circle, the university-educated canons of the medieval cathedral, who, of course, were going to be the principal audience of this window. We also know through our research accompanying the conservation that in some respects the iconography of the window was informed to some degree by a familiarity with the very common history of illumination in manuscripts of the Apocalypse story. The window seems to be familiar with at least 2 of the very numerous families of medieval illuminated manuscripts depicting the apocalypse. And I'm just comparing here the Douse apocalypse of about 1260 with the same scene in the east window. Now, iconographically, these share the same picture components, if you like, but there's a way in which Thornton has, I think, re-envisions this story in a tremendously lively way. And I think we have to throw into the mix the possibility that he had also read the Wycliffite Bible, which was the first of the English translations of the Bible available in the Middle Ages. This is an interesting scene because here you see a glass painter's mind at work, a glazier's mind at work. He actually takes those stars, which according to the text should be placed on the hand of the Son of Man, and he actually twirls them through against the background red of the panel and distributes them amongst the candlesticks so that they become visible from a long distance away. So, the portraying, what does that mean, the cartooning, what does it mean? In the Middle Ages, of course, it means drawing out the cartoons not on paper rolls, but of course on these large whitewashed tables, which are described as early as the 12th century by Theophilus. And this is the most famous surviving example in Girona Cathedral, with one of the canopies that was made from that board. We know that these boards were then washed for reuse. They were cleaned down once one design was finished with and a new design was placed on the table, and we see this in the evidence at Girona. I hope you can just see the shadowy figure of the Virgin Annunciate underlying a later geometric design. But one of the things that strikes one immediately about the Great East Window of York Minster is that the tables on which the panels were made were immensely complicated compared to the tables surviving in Girona. Almost every single scene is unique because of the nature of the narrative. So it would actually be very difficult to reuse the table for repeated elements, you're pretty much having to draw up a new table for each panel. And that's just another example. And we noticed some evidence of how these tables are working in the east window. And I've just highlighted in red 4 panels which appeared to be in the incorrect position in the window. These are the first of the 4 angels blowing, there are 7 of them in all, blowing trumpets which herald various cataclysmic events in the book of the Revelation. And that is the scene, those are the 4 scenes in the correct order. And this sequence begins at the end of one row. If I just go back, it begins at the end of row 9 and it carries through into the beginning of row 8 in the window. And that is the correct order, first, second, third and fourth angel. And there's no mistaking, that is the correct biblical order. But in fact, in the 17th century, they were in this order, in other words, second, third, fourth and first. And earlier scholars had proposed that this apparent mix-up of panels represented some kind of undocumented post-medieval intervention. Some glazier came along, took a bunch of panels out and put them back in the wrong order. But in fact, we feel that this is not the correct explanation, because one of the things we noticed was that each row has its own discrete canopy design. So in a 9-light window, there ought to be 9 of each canopy design. The differences are quite small. If you look in the spandrels of the canopies, you can see the differences. And we realised that we had 10 of one design and only 8 of another. So there was a bit of a mix-up here in canopy and scene. Something similar happened in the rows 2 and 3, and I'm showing you a row 2 canopy and a row 3 canopy. And lo and behold, we found a row 2 panel framed in a row 3 canopy. So how do we explain these apparent minor production errors? Well, if we go back to the Girona table, we see the evidence of, on the single design, of the canopy looking relatively clean and pristine, and the lower part of the table having this dirty, smudgy appearance. And this is because the lower part of the table has been washed for the insertion of a new design, whereas they have retained the upper part of the design, because that part of the design, the canopy, will carry through across a whole range of figures. So this is an economical use of the table. And we believe that this represents an explanation of our apparent anomalies in the Great East Window. In other words, they were washing the lower parts of the table within the canopies and inserting a new narrative, and particularly in rows 9 and 8, where a sequence is crossing through 2 rows of the window, basically they make a bit of a muck-up of it. Now, whether they noticed this in the 15th century and just thought, let's keep quiet, nobody will notice, or whether they simply didn't notice, I don't know. All I can say, it's taken 600 years for anybody else to notice. And I think rather hearteningly, the cathedral has decided to retain the apparent error because we felt in the end that the historical story, the narrative behind this mistake, was actually more interesting than just having 7 trumpeting angels in the right biblical order. So, back to the table. Well, one of the other things that's remarkable about the Girona table is the relative paucity of painted detail on it. It's long been noted that it doesn't conform to what Theophilus tells us about these painted tables, because he says all the detail you want to convey, paint it on the table. Well, as you can see, it isn't painted on the table. And we can stick here with this one. And we found evidence to suggest that that the tables for the east window looked something similar. In other words, the cartooning conveyed the general outline. Everybody knew what was going to go in there, but the individual painters were given a degree of autonomy working within the cartoon. And interestingly, we found these slight differences that suggest perhaps we're looking at different painters within the same same panels on opposite sides of the table. So one could almost imagine that you've got a painter on one side of the table, a painter on the other, and they're working on the same cartoon, but they're not working, that we've got two hands and they're working on different bits of the same panel. Within this group of painters, however, there are clearly some specialists, because one of the hallmarks of this window is that it has an extraordinary amount of textual interpolation. Whenever in the book of Revelation there are spoken words, whenever, for example, the angel says to John, "Come and see," or "Sit and write," we have those words. It's almost as if this is conceived as a kind of animated narrative in which people have speaking parts, and whenever their speaking parts are recorded in the biblical text, they appear in scrolls. And some of the books also, as you can see, have beautifully lettered Latin text. This Latin is perfect. I think we found 2 errors in the Latin, and it is Latin with the normal contractions and abbreviation marks laid out between guidelines with word spaces, and in places we can also see lettering overlying decorations. So it looks as if we have a team, I don't know whether it's 1 or 2 people, but people who are almost glass painting scribes who can come in and do this perfect lettering after the basic painting is done. The other thing that struck me when I actually finally went to see the table is that, again, Theophilus says, draw in all the lines where the lead lines are to go. Well, I needn't explain to you here, but when you look at the table, you can see lots of ways in which actually it doesn't have all the lead lines marked at all. If you just look, for example, at the gable, the pinnacle of the gable, that V shape has to be broken up with lead lines, and they're simply not there. Well, the explanation seems to me to be that they were clever enough to realise that when you're cutting sheets of precious glass, it's a good idea to leave the glazes a bit of leeway on where they cut the pieces and where they put their lead lines. And if you look across the Girona table and you look at all of the canopies made on that table, you can see slight variations in where the lead lines are positioned. And it seems to me that that takes us into another realm. For many years we've discussed at great length the meaning of these mysterious Glaziers sorting marks. In masonry, sorting marks are usually made to indicate 2 things. First of all, the position of something in a cumulative modular construction. So this is block 4, and the next one's block 3, etc. The other way they use them is to mark piecework, because the masons are being paid by numbers of stone cut. So they all have their own mark, and indeed, if you visit a mason's workshop now, they still do that. Certainly at York they did, and I think they did here at Brynathin. It doesn't work in stained glass, or at least you can make it work a bit and then it stops working. But actually, if we think of this table as something in which, while it is the tables may have a number of pieces made on top of them, they all have variations on a theme. So each individual canopy is cut in a slightly different way. It does mean that once everything goes off to the kiln for firing, it jolly well needs to be sorted properly, because actually pieces cut for canopy A, even if made on this table, will not fit back and lead up into canopy B. And I think that this study does suggest that the explanation for these otherwise mysterious and barely discernible marks. I just wanted to show you 2 details which really, in a way, connected us with the medieval Glaziers in ways that we hadn't anticipated. Not surprisingly, in a number of places we find fingerprints, in fact actually often thumbprints. And I must say we get ridiculously excited when we find these, because it just connects you with those painters of the past in a tremendously visceral fashion. Interestingly, they're always in the subsidiary parts of the window. I suspect if John Thornton had walked through the shop and seen a thumbprint in the middle of God's nose, he would have made them do it again. But nonetheless, they are exciting to find. And using the microscope, we also found what we thought initially were little bits of cotton left from the swabbing, the cleaning of the glass. And then we actually realised that they weren't cotton left by 21st century conservators. They were little threads left on the clothing, left from the clothing of the medieval craftsmen. They'd got caught in the sticky paint, and of course they'd then burnt off in the kiln. And I hope you can see, I'll walk across, I won't be able to speak, but I'll walk across and point them out, because I don't think these, it's up in this area here, and there's one there and one there. And it's little things like that which have made the whole process seem so human, because it's connected us with our medieval forebears. And I'd just like to close by saying that in a way, we haven't found John Thornton. We still have questions about John Thornton's contribution that we can't unravel. But I'd like to vote with Francis Drake, who said, "This window was begun to be glazed at the charge of the Dean and Chapter, who then contracted with John Thornton of Coventry. We may suppose this man to have been the best artist in his time for this kind of work, by their sending so far for him, and indeed the window shows it. I hope my drawer and engraver have done justice to his memory, and so say I." Thank you very much.